Chapter 19 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Little Men, Life at Plumfield with Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 19, John Brooke. Wake up, Demi, dear. I want you. Why, I've just gone to bed. It can't be morning yet. And Demi blinked like a little owl as he waked from his first sound sleep. It's only 10, but your father is ill, and we must go to him. Oh, my little John, my poor little John. And Aunt Jo laid her head down on the pillow with a sob that scared sleep from Demi's eyes and filled his heart with fear and wonder. For he dimly felt why Aunt Jo called him John, and wept over him as if some loss had come that left him poor. He clung to her without a word, and in a minute she was quite steady again, and said, with a tender kiss as she saw his troubled face, "We are going to say good-bye to him, my darling, and there is no time to lose. So dress quickly and come to me in my room. I must go to Daisy." "Yes, I will." And when Aunt Jo was gone, little Demi got up quietly, dressed as if in a dream, and leaving Tommy fast asleep, went away through the silent house, feeling that something new and sorrowful was going to happen, something that set him apart from the other boys for a time, and made the world seem as dark and still and strange as those familiar rooms did in the night. A carriage sent by Mr. Lorry stood before the door. Daisy was soon ready, and the brother and sister held each other by the hand all the way into town. As they drove swiftly and silently with aunt and uncle through the shadowy roads to say good-bye to father, none of the boys but France and Emil knew what had happened, and when they came down next morning, great was their wonderment and discomfort, for the house seemed forlorn without its master and mistress. Breakfast was a dismal meal with no cheery Mrs. Jo behind the teapots, and when school-time came, Father Bear's place was empty. They wandered about in a disconsolate kind of way for an hour, waiting for news and hoping it would be all right with Demi's father, for good John Brooke was much beloved by the boys. 10 o'clock came, and no one arrived to relieve their anxiety. They did not feel like playing, yet the time dragged heavily, and they sat about listless and sober. All at once Franz got up and said in his most persuasive way, "Look here, boys, let's go into school and do our lessons just as if Uncle was here. It will make the day go faster, and will please him, I know." "But who will hear us say them?" asked Jack. "I will. I don't know much more than you do, but I'm the oldest here, and I'll try to fill Uncle's place till he comes, if you don't mind." Something in the modest, serious way Franz said this impressed the boys, for though the poor lad's eyes were red with quiet crying for Uncle John in that long, sad night, there was a new manliness about him, as if he had already begun to feel the cares and troubles of life, and tried to take them bravely. "I will, for one," and Emil went to his seat, remembering that obedience to a superior officer is a seaman's first duty. The others followed. Franz took his uncle's seat, and for an hour order reigned. Lessons were learned and said, and Franz made a patient, pleasant teacher, wisely omitting such lessons as he was not equal to, and keeping order more by the unconscious dignity that sorrow gave him than by any words of his own. The little boys were reading when a step was heard in the hall, and every one looked up to read the news in Mr. Bear's face as he came in. The kind face told them instantly that Demi had no father now, for it was worn and pale and full of tender grief, which left no words with which to answer Rob as he ran to him, saying reproachfully, "What made you go and leave me in the night, papa?" The memory of the other father who had left his children in the night, never to return, made Mr. Bear hold his own boy close, and for a minute hide his face in Robbie's curly hair. Emil laid his head down on his arms. Franz went to put his hand on his uncle's shoulder, his boyish face pale with sympathy and sorrow, and the others sat so still that the soft rustle of the falling leaves outside was distinctly heard. Rob did not clearly understand what had happened, but he hated to see Papa unhappy, so he lifted up the bent head and said, in his chirpy little voice, "Don't cry, my invader. We are all so good. We did our lessons without you, and Franz was the master." Mr. Bear looked up then, tried to smile, and said in a grateful tone that made the lads feel like saints, "I thank you very much, my boys. It was a beautiful way to help and comfort me. I shall not forget it, I assure you." "Franz proposed it, and was a first-rate master, too," said Nat, and the others gave a murmur of assent most gratifying to the young dominie. Mr. Bear put Rob down, and standing up, put his arm round his tall nephew's shoulder as he said with a look of genuine pleasure, "This makes my hard day easier, and gives me confidence in you all. I am needed there in town, and must leave you for some hours. I thought to give you a holiday, or send some of you home, but if you like to stay and go on as you have begun, I shall be glad and proud of my boys." "We'll stay. We'd rather. Franz can see to us," cried several, delighted with the confidence shown in them. "Isn't Marmar coming home?" asked Rob wistfully, for home without Marmar was the world without the sun to him. "We shall both come to-night, but dear Aunt Meg needs mother more than you do now, and I know you like to lend her for a little while." "Well, I will, but Teddy's been crying for her, and he slapped Nursey, and was dreadful naughty," answered Rob, as if the news might bring mother home. "Where is my little man?" asked Mr. Bear. "Dan took him out to keep him quiet. He's all right now," said Franz, pointing to the window through which they could see Dan drawing Baby in his little wagon, with the dogs frolicking about him. "I won't see him. It would only upset him again. But tell Dan I leave Teddy in his care. You older boys I trust to manage yourselves for a day. Franz will direct you, and Silas is here to oversee matters. So good by till to-night." "Just tell me a word about Uncle John," said Emil, detaining Mr. Bear, as he was about hurrying away again. "He was only ill a few hours, and died as he lived, so cheerfully, so peacefully, that it seems a sin to mar the beauty of it with any violent or selfish grief. We were in time to say good by, and Daisy and Demi were in his arms as he fell asleep on Aunt Meg's breast. No more now, I cannot bear it." And Mr. Bear went hastily away, quite bowed with grief, for in John Brooke he had lost both friend and brother, and there was no one left to take his place. All that day the house was very still. The small boys played quietly in the nursery. The others, feeling as if Sunday had come in the middle of the week, spent it in walking, sitting in the willow, or among their pets, all talking much of Uncle John, and feeling that something gentle, just, and strong had gone out of their little world, leaving a sense of loss that deepened every hour. At dusk Mr. and Mrs. Bear came home alone, for Demi and Daisy were their mother's best comfort now, and could not leave her. Poor Mrs. Joe seemed quite spent, and evidently needed the same sort of comfort, for her first words, as she came up the stairs, were, "Where is my baby?" "Here I is," answered a little voice, as Dan put Teddy into her arms, adding, as she hugged him close, "My Danny took care of me all day, and I was dood." Mrs. Joe turned to thank the faithful nurse, but Dan was waving off the boys who had gathered in the hall to meet her, and was saying in a low voice, Keep back. She don't want to be bothered with us now." "No, don't keep back. I want you all. Come in and see me, my boys. I've neglected you all day." And Mrs. Joe held out her hands to them as they gathered round, and escorted her into her own room, saying little, but expressing much by affectionate looks and clumsy little efforts to show their sorrow and sympathy. "I am so tired. I will lie here and cuddle Teddy, and you shall bring me in some tea," she said, trying to speak cheerfully for their sakes. A general stampede into the dining room followed, and the supper table would have been ravaged if Mr. Bear had not interfered. It was agreed that one squad should carry in the mother's tea, and another bring it out. The 4 nearest and dearest claimed the first honor, so Franz bore the teapot, Emil the bread, Rob the milk, and Teddy insisted on carrying the sugar basin, which was lighter by several lumps when it arrived than when it started. Some women might have found it annoying at such a time to have boys creaking in and out, upsetting cups and rattling spoons in violent efforts to be quiet and helpful. But it suited Mrs. Joe, because just then her heart was very tender, and remembering that many of her boys were fatherless or motherless, she yearned over them and found comfort in their blundering affection. It was the sort of food that did her more good than the very thick bread and butter they gave her, and the rough Commodore's broken whisper, "Bear up, auntie, it's a hard blow, but we'll weather it somehow," cheered her more than the sloppy cup he brought her, full of tea as bitter as if some salt tear of his own had dropped into it on the way. When supper was over, a second deputation removed the tray, and Dan said, holding out his arms for sleepy little Teddy, "Let me put him to bed. You're so tired, mother." "Will you go with him, lovey?" asked Mrs. Joe of her small lord and master, who lay on her arm among the sofa pillows. "'Torse I will," and he was proudly carried off by his faithful bearer. "I wish I could do something," said Nat with a sigh, as Franz leaned over the sofa and softly stroked Aunt Joe's hot forehead. "You can, dear. Go and get your violin, and play me the sweet little airs Uncle Teddy sent you last. Music will comfort me better than anything else to-night." Nat flew for his fiddle, and sitting just outside her door, played as he had never done before, for now his heart was in it, and seemed to magnetize his fingers. The other lads sat quietly upon the steps, keeping watch that no newcomers should disturb the house. Franz lingered at his post, and so soothed, served, and guarded by her boys, poor Mrs. Joe slept at last, and forgot her sorrow for an hour. 2 quiet days, and on the 3rd Mr. Bear came in just after school, with a note in his hand, looking both moved and pleased. "I want to read you something, boys," he said, and as they stood round him he read this: "Dear Brother Fritz, I hear that you do not mean to bring your flock to-day, thinking that I may not like it. Please do. The sight of his friends will help Demi through the hard hour, and I want the boys to hear what father says of my John. It will do them good, I know. If they would sing one of the sweet old hymns you have taught them so well, I should like it better than any other music, and feel that it was beautifully suited to the occasion. Please ask them, with my love, Meg." "Will you go?" And Mr. Bear looked at the lads, who were greatly touched by Mrs. Brooks's kind words and wishes. "Yes," they answered, like one boy, and an hour later they went away with Franz to bear their part in John Brooks's simple funeral. The little house looked as quiet, sunny, and homelike as when Meg entered it as a bride 10 years ago. Only then it was early summer, and rose bloomed everywhere. Now it was early autumn, and dead leaves rustled softly down, leaving the branches bare. The bride was a widow now, but the same beautiful serenity shone in her face, and the sweet resignation of a truly pious soul made her presence a consolation to those who came to comfort her. "Oh, Meg, how can you bear it so?" whispered Joe, as she met them at the door with a smile of welcome, and no change in her gentle manner except more gentleness. "Dear Joe, the love that has blessed me for 10 happy years supports me still. It could not die, and John is more my own than ever," whispered Meg, and in her eyes the tender trust was so beautiful and bright that Joe believed her, and thanked God for the immortality of love like hers. They were all there, father and mother, Uncle Teddy and Aunt Amy, old Mr. Lawrence, white-haired and feeble now, Mr. and Mrs. Bear with their flock, and many friends, come to do honor to the dead. One would have said that modest John Brooke, in his busy, quiet, humble life, had had little time to make friends, but now they seemed to start up everywhere, old and young, rich and poor, high and low, for all unconsciously his influence had made itself widely felt. His virtues were remembered, and his hidden charities rose up to bless him. The group about his coffin was a far more eloquent eulogy than any Mr. March could utter. There were the rich men whom he had served faithfully for years, the poor old women whom he cherished with his little store, in memory of his mother, the wife to whom he had given such happiness that death could not mar it utterly, the brothers and sisters in whose hearts he had made a place for ever, the little son and daughter who already felt the loss of his strong arm and tender voice, the young children sobbing for their kindest playmate, and the tall lads watching with softened faces a scene which they never could forget. A very simple service, and very short, for the fatherly voice that had faltered in the marriage sacrament now failed entirely as Mr. March endeavored to pay his tribute of reverence and love to the son whom he most honored. Nothing but the soft coo of baby Josie's voice upstairs broke the long hush that followed the last amen, till at a sign from Mr. Bear the well-trained boyish voices broke out in a hymn so full of lofty cheer that one by one all joined in it, singing with full hearts, and finding their troubled spirits lifted into peace on the wings of that brave, sweet psalm. As Meg listened, she felt that she had done well, for not only did the moment comfort her with the assurance that John's last lullaby was sung by the young voices he loved so well, but in the faces of the boys she saw that they had caught a glimpse of the beauty of virtue in its most impressive form, and that the memory of the good man lying dead before them would live long and helpfully in their remembrance. Daisy's head lay in her lap, and Demi held her hand, looking often at her with eyes so like his father's, and a little gesture that seemed to say, "Don't be troubled, mother, I am here." And all about her were friends to lean upon and love. So patient, pious Meg put by her heavy grief, feeling that her best help would be to live for others as her John had done. That evening, as the Plumfield boys sat on the steps as usual, in the mild September moonlight, they naturally fell to talking of the event of the day. Emil began by breaking out, in his impetuous way, "Uncle Fritz is the wisest, and Uncle Laurie the jolliest, but Uncle John was the best, and I'd rather be like him than any man I ever saw." "So would I. Did you hear what those gentlemen said to Grandpa to-day? I would like to have that said of me when I was dead." And Franz felt with regret that he had not appreciated Uncle John enough. "What did they say?" asked Jack, who had been much impressed by the scenes of the day. "Why, one of the partners of Mr. Lawrence, where Uncle John has been ever so long, was saying that he was conscientious almost to a fault as a business man, and above reproach in all things. Another gentleman said no money could repay the fidelity and honesty with which Uncle John had served him. And then Grandpa told them the best of all. Uncle John once had a place in the office of a man who cheated, and when this man wanted Uncle to help him do it, Uncle wouldn't, though he was offered a big salary. The man was angry and said, "You will never get on in business with such strict principles." And Uncle answered back, "I never will try to get on without them," and left the place for a much harder and poorer one. "Good!" cried several of the boys warmly, for they were in the mood to understand and value the little story as never before. "He wasn't rich, was he?" asked Jack. "No." "He never did anything to make a stir in the world, did he?" "No." "He was only good?" "That's all." And Franz found himself wishing that Uncle John had done something to boast of, for it was evident that Jack was disappointed by his replies. "Only good, that is all and everything," said Mr. Bear, who had overheard the last few words and guessed what was going on in the minds of the lads. "Let me tell you a little about John Brooke, and you will see why men honor him, and why he was satisfied to be good rather than rich or famous. He simply did his duty in all things, and did it so cheerfully, so faithfully, that it kept him patient and brave, and happy through poverty and loneliness and years of hard work. He was a good son, and gave up his own plans to stay and live with his mother while she needed him. He was a good friend, and taught Laurie much beside his Greek and Latin, did it unconsciously perhaps, by showing him an example of an upright man. He was a faithful servant, and made himself so valuable to those who employed him that they will find it hard to fill his place. He was a good husband and father, so tender, wise, and thoughtful that Laurie and I learned much of him, and only knew how well he loved his family when we discovered all he had done for them, unsuspected and unassisted." Mr. Bear stopped a minute, and the boys sat like statues in the moonlight until he went on again, in a subdued but earnest voice. "As he lay dying, I said to him, 'Have no care for Meg and the little ones. I will see that they never want.' Then he smiled and pressed my hand, and answered in his cheerful way, 'No need of that. I have cared for them.' And so he had. For when we looked among his papers, all was in order. Not a debt remained, and safely put away was enough to keep Meg comfortable and independent. Then we knew why he had lived so plainly, denied himself so many pleasures, except that of charity, and worked so hard that I fear he shortened his good life. He never asked help for himself, though often for others, but bore his own burden and worked out his own task bravely and quietly. No one can say a word of complaint against him, so just and generous and kind was he. And now, when he is gone, all find so much to love and praise and honor, that I am proud to have been his friend, and would rather leave my children the legacy he leaves his than the largest fortune ever made. Yes, simple, generous goodness is the best capital to found the business of this life upon. It lasts when fame and money fail, and is the only riches we can take out of this world with us. Remember that, my boys, and if you want to earn respect and confidence and love, follow in the steps of John Brooke." When Demi returned to school after some weeks at home, he seemed to have recovered from his loss with the blessed elasticity of childhood. And so he had in a measure, but he did not forget, for his was a nature into which things sank deeply, to be pondered over and absorbed into the soil where the small virtues were growing fast. He played and studied, worked and sang, just as before, and few suspected any change. But there was one, and Aunt Jo saw it, for she watched over the boy with her whole heart, trying to fill John's place in her poor way. He seldom spoke of his loss, but Aunt Jo often heard a stifled sobbing in the little bed at night, and when she went to comfort him all his cry was, "I want my father! Oh, I want my father!" For the tie between the two had been a very tender one, and the child's heart bled when it was broken. But time was kind to him, and slowly he came to feel that father was not lost, only invisible for a while, and sure to be found again, well and strong and fond as ever, even though his little son should see the purple asters blossom on his grave many, many times before they met. To this belief Demi held fast, and in it found both help and comfort, because it led him unconsciously through a tender longing for the father whom he had seen to a childlike trust in the father whom he had not seen. Both were in heaven, and he prayed to both, trying to be good for love of them. The outward change corresponded to the inward, for in those few weeks Demi seemed to have grown tall and begun to drop his childish plays, not as if ashamed of them as some boys do, but as if he had outgrown them, and wanted something manlier. He took to the hated arithmetic, and held on so steadily that his uncle was charmed, though he could not understand the whim until Demi said, "I am going to be a bookkeeper when I grow up like papa, and I must know about figures and things, else I can't have nice, neat ledgers like his." At another time he came to his aunt with a very serious face, and said, "What can a small boy do to earn money?" "Why do you ask, my dearie?" "My father told me to take care of mother and the little girls, and I want to, but I don't know how to begin." "He did not mean now, Demi, but by and by when you are large." "But I wish to begin now if I can, because I think I ought to make some money to buy things for the family. I am 10, and other boys no bigger than I earn pennies sometimes." "Well, then, suppose you rake up all the dead leaves and cover the strawberry bed. I'll pay you $1 for the job," said Aunt Jo. "Isn't that a great deal? I could do it in one day. You must be fair and not pay me too much, because I want to truly earn it." "My little John, I will be fair and not pay a penny too much. Don't work too hard, and when that is done I will have something else for you to do," said Mrs. Joe, much touched by his desire to help, and his sense of justice, so like his scrupulous father. When the leaves were done, many barrow-loads of chips were wheeled from the wood to the shed, and another $1 earned. Then Demi helped cover the school books, working in the evenings under Franz's direction, tugging patiently away at each book, letting no one help, and receiving his wages with such satisfaction that the dingy bills became quite glorified in his sight. "Now I have $1 for each of them, and I should like to take my money to mother all myself, so she can see that I have minded my father." So Demi made a duteous pilgrimage to his mother, who received his little earnings as a treasure of great worth, and would have kept it untouched if Demi had not begged her to buy some useful thing for herself and the women children, whom he felt were left to his care. This made him very happy, and though he often forgot his responsibilities for a time, the desire to help was still there, strengthening with his years. He always uttered the words "my father" with an air of gentle pride, and often said, as if he claimed a title full of honor, "Don't call me Demi any more. I am John Brooke now." So, strengthened by a purpose and a hope, the little lad of 10 bravely began the world, and entered into his inheritance the memory of a wise and tender father, the legacy of an honest name. End of Chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Sandra Martin. Little Men, Life at Plumfield with Joe's Boys by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 20. Round the Fire. With the October frost came the cheery fires in the great fireplaces, and Demmy's dry pine chips helped Dan's oak knots to blaze royally and go roaring up the chimney with a jolly sound. All were glad to gather round the hearth as the evenings grew longer to play games, read, or lay plans for the winter. But the favorite amusement was story-telling, and Mr. and Mrs. Bear were expected to have a store of lively tales always on hand. Their supply occasionally gave out, and then the boys were thrown upon their own resources, which were not always successful. Ghost parties were the rage at one time, for the fun of the thing consisted in putting out the lights, letting the fire die down, and then sitting in the dark and telling the most awful tales they could invent. As this resulted in scares of all sorts among the boys, Tommy's walking in his sleep on the shed roof, and a general state of nervousness in the little ones, it was forbidden, and they fell back on more harmless amusements. One evening, when the small boys were snugly tucked in bed, and the older lads were lounging about the schoolroom fire, trying to decide what they should do, Demmy suggested a new way of settling the question. Seizing the hearth-brush, he marched up and down the room, saying, "Row, row, row," and when the boys, laughing and pushing, had got into line, he said, "Now, I'll give you 2 minutes to think of a play." Franz was writing, and Emil reading the Life of Lord Nelson, and neither joined the party, but the others thought hard, and when the time was up, were ready to reply. "Now, Tom," and the poker softly rapped him on the head. "Blind man's buff." "Jack." "Commerce, a good round game, and have sense for the pool." "Uncle forbids our playing for money. Dan, what do you want?" "Let's have a battle between the Greeks and Romans." "Stuffy?" "Roast apples, popcorn, and cracked nuts." "Good, good," cried several, and when the vote was taken, Stuffy's proposal carried the day. Some went to the cellar for apples, some to the garret for nuts, and others looked up the popper and the corn. "We'd better ask the girls to come in, hadn't we?" said Demmy in a sudden fit of politeness. "Daisy pricks chestnuts beautifully," put in Nat, who wanted his little friend to share the fun. "Nan pops corn tip-top. We must have her," added Tommy. "Bring in your sweethearts, then. We don't mind," said Jack, who laughed at the innocent regard the little people had for one another. "You shan't call my sister a sweetheart. It is so silly," cried Demmy, in a way that made Jack laugh. "She is Nat's darling, isn't she, old chipper?" "Yes, if Demmy don't mind, I can't help being fond of her. She is so good to me," answered Nat with bashful earnestness, for Jack's rough ways disturbed him. "Nan is my sweetheart, and I shall marry her in about a year, so don't you get in the way, any of you," said Tommy stoutly, for he and Nan had settled their future child-fashion, and were to live in the willow, lower down a basket for food, and do other charmingly impossible things. Demmy was quenched by the decision of Bangs, who took him by the arm and walked him off to get the ladies. Nan and Daisy were sewing with Aunt Jo on certain small garments for Mrs. Kearney's newest baby. "Please, ma'am, could you lend us the girls for a little while? We'll be very careful of them," said Tommy, winking one eye to express apples, snapping his fingers to signify popcorn, and gnashing his teeth to convey the idea of nut-cracking. The girls understood this pantomime at once, and began to pull off their thimbles before Mrs. Jo could decide whether Tommy was going into convulsions or was brewing some unusual piece of mischief. Demmy explained with elaboration, permission was readily granted, and the boys departed with their prize. "Don't you speak to Jack," whispered Tommy as he and Nan promenaded down the hall to get a fork to prick the apples. "Why not?" "He laughs at me, and I don't wish you to have anything to do with him." "Shall if I like," said Nan, promptly resenting this premature assumption of authority on the part of her lord. "Then I won't have you for my sweetheart." "I don't care." "Why, Nan, I thought you were fond of me," and Tommy's voice was full of tender reproach. "If you mind Jack's laughing, I don't care for you one bit." "Then you may take back your old ring. I won't wear it any longer." And Tommy plucked off a horsehair pledge of affection which Nan had given him in return for one made of a lobster's feeler. "I shall give it to Ned," was her cruel reply, for Ned liked Mrs. Giddy-Gaddy and had turned her clothespins, boxes, and spools enough to set up housekeeping with. Tommy said, "Thunder turtles!" as the only vent equal to pent-up anguish of the moment, and dropping Nan's arm, retired in high dudgeon, leaving her to follow with a fork, a neglect which naughty Nan punished by proceeding to prick his heart with jealousy, as if it were another sort of apple. The hearth was swept, and the rosy Baldwins put down to roast. A shovel was heated, and the chestnuts danced merrily upon it, while the corn popped wildly in its wire prison. Dan cracked his best walnuts, and everyone chattered and laughed while the rain beat on the window-pane and the wind howled round the house. "Why is Billy like this nut?" asked Emil, who was frequently inspired with bad conundrums. "Because he is cracked," answered Ned. "That's not fair. You mustn't make fun of Billy because he can't hit back. It's mean," cried Dan, smashing a nut wrathfully. "To what family of insects does Blake belong?" asked Peacemaker Franz, seeing that Emil looked ashamed and Dan lowering. "Gnats," answered Jack. "Why is Daisy like a bee?" cried Nat, who had been wrapped in thought for several minutes. "Because she is queen of the hive," said Dan. "No." "Because she is sweet." "Bees are not sweet." "Give it up." "Because she makes sweet things, is always busy, and likes flowers," said Nat, piling up his boyish compliments till Daisy blushed like a rosy clover. "Why is Nan like a hornet?" demanded Tommy, glowering at her, and adding, without giving anyone time to answer, "Because she isn't sweet, makes a great buzzing about nothing, and stings like Furry." "Tommy's mad, and I'm glad," cried Ned, as Nan tossed her head and answered quickly, "What thing in the china closet is Tom like?" "A pepper pot," answered Ned, giving Nan a nut meat with a tantalizing laugh that made Tommy feel as if he would like to bounce up like a hot chestnut and hit somebody. Seeing that ill humor was getting the better of the small supply of wit in the company, Franz cast himself into the breach again. "Let's make a law that the first person who comes into the room shall tell us a story. No matter who it is, he must do it, and it will be fun to see who comes in first." The others agreed and did not have to wait long, for a heavy step soon came clumping through the hall, and Silas appeared, bearing an armful of wood. He was greeted by a general shout, and stood staring about him with a bewildered grin on his big red face, till Franz explained the joke. "Sho! I can't tell a story," he said, putting down his load and preparing to leave the room. But the boys fell upon him, forced him into a seat, and held him there laughing and clamoring for their story, till the good-natured giant was overpowered. "I don't know but just one story, and that's about a horse," he said, much flattered by the reception he received. "Tell it, tell it!" cried the boys. "Wall," began Silas, tipping his chair back against the wall and putting his thumbs in the armholes of his waistcoat, "I jined a cavalry regiment during the war, and see a considerable amount of fighting. My horse Major was a first-rate animal, and I was fond of him as if he had been a human critter. He weren't handsome, but he was the best-tempered, steadiest, lovin'est brute I ever see. The first battle we went into, he gave me a lesson that I didn't forget in a hurry, and I'll tell you how it was. It ain't no use trying to picture the noise and hurry and general hordness of a battle to you young fellers, for I ain't no words to do it in. But I'm free to confess that I got so sort of confused and upset at the fust of it that I didn't know what I was about. We was ordered to charge and went ahead like good ones, never stopping to pick up them that went down in the scrimmage. I got shot in the arm and was pitched out of the saddle don't know how, but there I was left behind with 2 or 3 others, dead and wounded, for the rest went on, as I say. Wall, I picked myself up and looked around for Major, feeling as if I'd had about enough for that spell. I didn't see him nowhere and was kinder walking back to camp when I heard a whinny that sounded natural. I looked around and there was Major stopping for me a long way off and looking as if he didn't understand why I was loitering behind. I whistled, and he trotted up to me as I'd trained him to do. I mounted as well as I could with my left arm bleeding, and was going on to camp, for I declare I felt as sick and wimbly as a woman. Folks often do in their fust battle, but no, sir, Major was the bravest of the two, and he wouldn't go, not a peg. He just reared up, and danced, and snorted, and acted as if the smell of powder and the noise had drove him half wild. I done my best, but he wouldn't give in, so I did. And what do you think that plucky brute done? He wheeled slap round and galloped back like a hurricane, right into the thickest of the scrimmage. Good for him, cried Dan excitedly, while the other boys forgot apples and nuts in their interest. I wish I may die if I weren't ashamed of myself, continued Silas, warming up at the recollection of that day. I was mad as a hornet, and I forgot my wound, and just pitched in, rampaging round like fury, till there come a shell into the midst of us, and in bustin' knocked a lot of us flat. I didn't know nothing for a spell, and when I come to, the fight was over just there, and I found myself layin' by a wall poor Major, 'longside was wounded than I was. My leg was broke, and I had a ball in my shoulder, but he, poor old feller, was all tore in the side with a piece of that blasted shell. "Oh, Silas, what did you do?" cried Nan, pressing close to him with a face full of eager sympathy and interest. I dragged myself nigher and tried to stop the bleedin' with such rags as I could tear off me with one hand, but it warn't no use, and he lay moanin' with horrid pain, and lookin' at me with them lovin' eyes of his till I thought I couldn't bear it. I give him all the help I could, and when the sun got hotter and hotter, and he began to lap out his tongue, I tried to get to the brook that was a good place away, but I couldn't do it, being stiff and faint, so I give it up and fanned him with my hat. Now you listen to this, and when you hear folks comin' down on the rebs, you just remember what one of 'em did, and give him credit of it. I, poor feller in gray, laid not fur off, shot through the lungs and dyin' fast. I had offered him my handkerchief to keep the sun off his face, and he thanked me kindly, for in such times as that men don't stop to think on which side they belong, but just buckle to and help one another. When he see me mournin' over Major and trying to ease his pain, he looked up with his face all damp and white with sufferin', and says he, "There's water in my canteen. Take it, for it can't help me." And he flung it to me. I couldn't have took it if I hadn't had a little brandy in a pocket flask, and I made him drink it. It done him good, and I felt as much set up as if I'd drunk it myself. It's surprisin' the good such little things do folks sometimes. And Silas paused as if he felt again the comfort of that moment when he and his enemy forgot their feud and helped one another like brothers. "Tell about Major!" cried the boys, impatient for the catastrophe. I poured water over his poor pantin' tongue, and if ever a dumb critter looked grateful, he did then. But it weren't of much use, for the dreadful wound kept on tormentin' him till I couldn't bear it any longer. It was hard, but I done it in mercy, and I know he forgive me. "What did you do?" asked Emil, as Silas stopped abruptly with a loud and a look in his rough face that made Daisy go and stand by him with her little hand on his knee. "I shot him." Quite a thrill went through the listeners as Silas said that, for Major seemed a hero in their eyes, and his tragic end roused all their sympathy. "Yes, I shot him, and put him out of his misery. I patted him fust and said, 'Good-bye.' Then I laid his head easy on the grass, give a last look into his loving eyes, and sent a bullet through his head. He hardly stirred, I aimed so true, but when I seen him quite still, with no more moanin' and pain, I was glad. And yet, while I don't know as I need be ashamed on it, I just put my arms around his neck and boo-hooed like a great baby. Sho! I didn't know I was sich a fool." And Silas drew his sleeve across his eyes, as much touched by Daisy's sob as by the memory of faithful Major. No one spoke for a minute, because the boys were as quick to feel the pathos of the little story as tender-hearted Daisy, though they did not show it by crying. "I'd like a horse like that," said Dan half aloud. "Did the rebel man die too?" asked Nan anxiously. "Not then. We laid there all day, and at night some of our fellers came to look after the missin' ones. They naturally wanted to take me fust, but I know I could wait, and the rebel had but one chance, maybe, so I made them carry him right off. He had just strength enough to hold out his hand to me and say, 'Thank ye, comrade,' and them was the last words he spoke before he died an hour after he got to the hospital tent." "How glad you must have been that you were kind to him," said Demi, who was deeply impressed by the story. "Wall, I did take comfort thinking of it, as I laid there alone for a number of hours with my head on Major's neck, and see the moon come up. I'd like to have buried the poor beast decent, but it weren't possible, so I cut off a bit of his mane, and I've kept it ever since. Want to see it, Sissy?" "Oh, yes, please," answered Daisy, wiping away her tears to look. Silas took out an old wallet, as he called his pocketbook, and produced from an inner fold a bit of brown paper in which was a rough lock of white horsehair. The children looked at it silently as it lay in the broad palm, and no one found anything to ridicule in the love Silas bore his good horse Major. "That was a sweet story, and I like it, though it did make me cry. Thank you very much, Si." And Daisy helped him fold and put away his little relic, while Nan stuffed a handful of popcorn into his pocket, and the boys loudly expressed their flattering opinions of his story, feeling that there had been two heroes in it. He departed quite overcome by his honors, and the little conspirators talked the tale over while they waited on their next victim. It was Mrs. Joe who came in to measure Nan for some new pinafores she was making for her. They let her get well in, and then pounced upon her, telling her the law and demanding the story. Mrs. Joe was very much amused at the new trap, and consented at once, for the sound of happy voices had been coming across the hall so pleasantly that she quite longed to join them and forget her own anxious thoughts of Sister Meg. "Am I the first mouse you have caught, you sly pussies in boots?" she asked as she was conducted to the big chair supplied with refreshments and surrounded by a flock of merry-faced listeners. They told her about Silas and his contribution, and she slapped her forehead in despair, for she was quite at her wits' end, being called upon so unexpectedly for a brand-new tale. "What shall I tell about?" she said. "Boys," was the general answer. "Have a party in it," said Daisy. "And something good to eat," added Stuffy. "That reminds me of a story written years ago by a dear old lady. I used to be very fond of it, and I fancy you will like it, for it has both boys and something good to eat in it." "What is it called?" asked Dimmy. "The Suspected Boy." Nat looked up from the nuts he was picking, and Mrs. Joe smiled at him, guessing what was in his mind. "Miss Crane kept a school for boys in a quiet little town, and a very good school it was, of the old-fashioned sort. 6 boys lived in her house, and 4 or 5 more came in from the town. Among those who lived with her was one named Louis White. Louis was not a bad boy, but rather timid, and now and then he told a lie. One day a neighbor sent Miss Crane a basket of gooseberries. There were not enough to go round, so kind Miss Crane, who liked to please her boys, went to work and made a dozen nice little gooseberry tarts. "I'd like to try gooseberry tarts. I wonder if she made them as I do my raspberry ones," said Daisy, whose interest in cooking had lately revived. "Hush!" said Nat, tucking a plump popcorn into her mouth to silence her, for he felt a particular interest in this tale and thought it opened well. When the tarts were done, Miss Crane put them away in the best parlor closet and said not a word about them, for she wanted to surprise the boys at tea time. When the minute came and all were seated at the table, she went to get her tarts, but came back looking much troubled, for what do you think had happened? "Somebody had hooked them!" cried Ned. "No, there they were, but someone had stolen all of the fruit out of them by lifting up the upper crust and then putting it down after the gooseberries had been scraped out. What a mean trick!" And Nan looked at Tommy as if to imply that he would. When she told the boys her plan and showed them the poor little patties all robbed of their sweetness, the boys were much grieved and disappointed, and all declared that they knew nothing about the matter. "Perhaps the rats did it," said Louis, who was among the loudest to deny any knowledge of the tarts. "No, rats would have nibbled crust and all, and never lifted it up and scooped out the fruit. Hens did that," said Miss Crane, who was more troubled about the lie that someone must have told than about her lost patties. Well, they had supper and went to bed, but in the night Miss Crane heard someone groaning, and going to see who it was, she found Louis in great pain. He had evidently eaten something that disagreed with him, and was so sick that Miss Crane was alarmed, and was going to send for the doctor, when Louis moaned out, "It's the gooseberries. I ate them, and I must tell before I die." For the thought of the doctor frightened him. "If that is all, I'll give you an emetic, and you will soon get over it," said Miss Crane. So Louis had a good dose, and by morning was quite comfortable. "Oh, don't tell the boys. They will laugh at me so," begged the invalid. Kind Miss Crane promised not to, but Sally, the girl, told the story, and poor Louis had no peace for a long time. His mates called him Old Gooseberry, and were never tired of asking him the price of tart. "Served him right," said Emil. "Badness always gets found out," said Dimmy morally. "No, it don't," muttered Jack, who was tending the apples with great devotion so that he might keep his back to the rest and account for his red face. "Is that all?" asked Dan. "No, that is only the first part. The second part is more interesting. Some time after this a peddler came by one day and stopped to show his things to the boys, several of whom bought pocket combs, jews' harps, and various trifles of that sort. Among the knives was a little white-handled penknife that Louis wanted very much, but he had spent all his pocket money, and no one had any to lend him. He held the knife in his hand, admiring and longing for it, till the man packed up his goods to go. Then he reluctantly laid it down, and the man went on his way. The next day, however, the peddler returned to say that he could not find that very knife, and thought he must have left it at Miss Crane's. It was a very nice one with a pearl handle, and he could not afford to lose it. Everyone looked, and everyone declared they knew nothing about it. This young gentleman had it last, and seemed to want it very much. "Are you quite sure you put it back?" said the man to Louis, who was much troubled at the loss, and vowed over and over again that he did return it. His denials seemed to do no good, however, for everyone was sure he had taken it, and after a stormy scene Miss Crane paid for it, and the man went grumbling away. "Did Louis have it?" cried Nate, much excited. "You will see. Now poor Louis had another trial to bear, for the boys were constantly saying, 'Lend me your pearl-handled knife, Gooseberry,' and things of that sort, till Louis was so unhappy he begged to be sent home. Miss Crane did her best to keep the boys quiet, but it was hard work, for they would tease, and she could not be with them all the time. That was one of the hardest things to teach boys. They won't hit a fellow when he is down, as they say, but they will torment him in little ways till he would thank them to fight it out all around." "I know that," said Dan. "So do I," added Nat softly. Jack said nothing, but he quite agreed, for he knew that the elder boys despised him and let him alone for that very reason. "Do go on about poor Louis, Aunt Jo. I don't believe he took the knife, but I want to be sure," said Daisy in great anxiety. Well, week after week went on, and the matter was not cleared up. The boys avoided Louis, and he, poor fellow, was almost sick with the trouble he had brought upon himself. He resolved never to tell another lie, and tried so hard that Miss Crane pitied and helped him, and really came at last to believe that he did not take the knife. 2 months after the peddler's first visit he came again, and the first thing he said was, "Well, ma'am, I found that knife after all. It had slipped behind the lining of my valise and fell out the other day when I was putting in a new stock of goods. I thought I'd call and let you know, as you paid for it and maybe would like it, so here it is." The boys had all gathered round, and at these words they felt much ashamed, and begged Louis's pardon so heartily that he could not refuse to give it. Miss Crane presented the knife to him, and he kept it many years to remind him of the fault that had brought him so much trouble. "I wonder why it is that things you eat on the sly hurt you, and don't when you eat them at the table," observed Stuffy thoughtfully. "Perhaps your conscience affects your stomach," said Mrs. Joe, smiling at his speech. "He's thinking of the cucumbers," said Ned, and a gale of merriment followed the words, for Stuffy's last mishap had been a funny one. He ate 2 large cucumbers in private, felt very ill, and confided his anguish to Ned, imploring him to do something. Ned good-naturedly recommended a mustard plaster and a hot flat-iron to the feet, only in applying these remedies he had reversed the order of things, and put the plaster on the feet, the flat-iron on the stomach, and poor Stuffy was found in the barn with blistered soles and a scorched jacket. "Suppose you tell another story. That was such an interesting one," said Nat as the laughter subsided. Before Miss Joe could refuse these insatiable Oliver Twists, Rob walked into the room, trailing his little bed cover after him, and wearing an expression of great sweetness as he said, staring straight to his mother as a sure haven of refuge, "I heard a great noise, and I thought something dreadful might have happened, so I came to see." "Did you think I would forget you, naughty boy?" asked his mother, trying to look stern. "No, but I thought you'd feel better to see me right here," responded the insinuating little party. "I'd much rather see you in bed, so march straight up again, Robin." "Everybody that comes in here has to tell a story, and you can't, so you'd better cut and run," said Emil. "Yes, I can. I tell Teddy lots of ones, all about bears and moons and little flies that say things when they buzz," protested Rob, bound to stay at any price. "Tell one now, then, right away," said Dan, preparing to shoulder and bear him off. "Well, I will. Let me think a minute." and Rob climbed into his mother's lap where he was cuddled with the remark, "It is a family failing, this getting out of bed at wrong times. Dimmy used to do it, and as for me, I was hopping in and out all night long. Meg used to think the house was on fire and send me down to see, and I used to stay and enjoy myself, as you mean to, my bad son." "I think now," observed Rob, quite at his ease and eager to win the entree into this delightful circle. Everyone looked and listened with faces full of suppressed merriment as Rob, perched on his mother's knee and wrapped in the gay coverlet, told the following brief but tragic tale with an earnestness that made it very funny. "Once a lady had 1,000,000 children and one nice little boy. She went upstairs and said, 'You mustn't go in the yard.' But he wented and fell into the pump and was drowned dead." "Is that all?" asked Franz as Rob paused out of breath with his startling beginning. "No, there's another piece of it," and Rob knit his downy eyebrows in the effort to involve another inspiration. "What did the lady do when he fell into the pump?" asked his mother to help him out. "Oh, she pumped him up and wrapped him in a newspaper and put him on a shelf to dry for seed." A general explosion of laughter greeted this surprising conclusion, and Mrs. Joe patted the curly head as she said solemnly, "My son, you inherit your mother's gift of storytelling. Go where glory waits thee." "Now I can stay, can't I? Wasn't it a good story?" cried Rob in high feather at his superb success. "You can stay till you've eaten those 12 popcorns," said his mother, expecting to see them vanish at one mouthful. But Rob was a shrewd little man, and got the better of her by eating them one by one, very slowly, and enjoying every minute with all his might. "Hadn't you better tell the other story while you wait for him?" said Dimmy, anxious that no time should be lost. "I really have nothing but a little tale about a wood box," said Mrs. Joe, seeing that Rob still had 7 corns to eat. "Is there a boy in it?" "It is all boy." "Is it true?" asked Dimmy. "Every bit of it." "Goody. Tell on, please." "James Snow and his mother lived in a little house up in New Hampshire. They were poor, and James had to work to help his mother, but he loved books so well he hated work and just wanted to sit and study all day long." "How could he? I hate books, and I like work," said Dan, objecting to James at the very outset. "It takes all sorts of people to make a world. Workers and students both are needed, and there is room for all. But I think the workers should study some, and the students should know how to work if necessary," answered Mrs. Joe, looking from Dan to Dimmy with a significant expression. "I'm sure I do work," and Dimmy showed 3 small hard spots in his little palm with pride. "And I'm sure I study," added Dan, nodding with a groan toward the blackboard full of neat figures. "See what James did? He did not mean to be selfish, but his mother was proud of him and let him do as he liked, working by herself that he might have books and time to read them. One autumn James wanted to go to school, and went to the minister to see if he would help him about decent clothes and books. Now the minister had heard the gossip about James' idleness, and was not inclined to do much for him, thinking that a boy who neglected his mother and let her slave for him was not likely to do very well, even at school. But the good man felt more interested when he found how earnest James was, and being rather an odd man, he made this proposal to the boy, to try how sincere he was. "I will give you clothes and books on one condition, James." "What is that, sir?" And the boy brightened up at once. "You are to keep your mother's woodbox full all winter long, and do it yourself. If you fail, school stops." James laughed at the queer condition and readily agreed to it, thinking it a very easy one. He began school, and for a time got on capitally with the woodbox, for it was autumn, and chips and brushwood were plentiful. He ran out morning and evening and got a basketful, or chopped up the cat sticks for the little cooking stove, and as his mother was careful in saving, the task was not hard. But in November the frost came, the days were dull and cold, and wood went fast. His mother bought a load with her own earnings, but it seemed to melt away and was nearly gone before James remembered that he had to get the next. Mrs. Snow was feeble and lame with rheumatism and unable to work as she had done, so James had to put down the books and see what he could do. It was hard, for he was going on well, and so interested in his lessons that he hated to stop except for food and sleep. But he knew the minister would keep his word, and much against his will James set about earning money in his spare hours, lest the woodbox should get empty. He did all sorts of things, ran errands, took care of a neighbor's cow, helped the old sexton dust and warm the church on Sundays, and in these ways got enough to buy fuel in small quantities. But it was hard work. The days were short, the winter was bitterly cold, and precious time went fast, and the dear books were so fascinating that it was sad to leave them for dull duties that never seemed done. The minister watched him quietly, and seeing that he was in earnest, helped him without his knowledge. He met him often driving the wood sleds from the forest, where the men were chopping, and as James plodded beside the slow oxen he read or studied, anxious to use every minute. "The boy is worth helping. This lesson will do him good, and when he has learned it, I will give him an easier one," said the minister to himself, and on Christmas Eve a splendid load of wood was quietly dropped at the door of the little house, with a new saw and a bit of paper saying only, "The Lord helps those who help themselves." Poor James expected nothing, but when he woke on that cold Christmas morning, he found a pair of warm mittens knit by his mother with her stiff, painful fingers. This gift pleased him very much, but her kiss and tender look as she called him her good son was better still. In trying to keep her warm, he had warmed his own heart, you see, and in filling the wood-box he had also filled those months with duties faithfully done. He began to see this, to feel that there was something better than books, and to try to learn the lessons God set him, as well as those his schoolmaster gave. When he saw the great pile of oak and pine logs at his door, and read the little paper, he knew who sent it, and understood the minister's plan, thanked him for it, and fell to work with all his might. Other boys frolicked that day, but James sawed wood, and I think of all the lads in the town the happiest was the one in the new mittens who whistled like a blackbird as he filled his mother's wood-box. "That's a first-rater," cried Dan, who enjoyed a simple matter-of-face story better than the finest fairy tale. "I like that fellow after all." "I could saw wood for you, Aunt Jo," said Dimmy, feeling as if new means of earning money for his mother was suggested by the story. "Tell about a bad boy. I like them best," said Nan. "You'd better tell about a naughty crosspatch of a girl," said Tommy, whose evening had been spoilt by Nan's unkindness. It made his apple taste bitter, his popcorn was insipid, his nuts were hard to crack, and the sight of Ned and Nan on one bench made him feel his life a burden. But there were no more stories for Miss Jo, for on looking down at Rob, he was discovered to be fast asleep with his last corn firmly clasped in his chubby hand. Bundling him up in his coverlet, his mother carried him away and tucked him up with no fear of his popping out again. "Now let's see who will come next," said Emil, setting the door temptingly ajar. Mary Ann passed first, and he called out to her, but Silas had warned her, and she only laughed and hurried on in spite of their enticements. Presently a door opened, and a strong voice was heard humming in the hall. "Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, dass ich so traurig bin." "It's Uncle Fritz. All laugh loud, and he will be sure to come in," said Emil. A wild burst of laughter followed, and in came Uncle Fritz, asking, "What is the joke, my lads?" "Caught! You can't go out till you've told a story," cried the boys, slamming the door. "So, that is the joke, then? Well, I have no wish to go. It is so pleasant here, and I pay my forfeit at once," which he did by sitting down and beginning instantly. "A long time ago your grandfather, Dimmy, went to lecture in a great town, hoping to get some money for a home for little orphans that some good people were getting up. His lecture did well, and he put a considerable sum of money in his pocket, feeling very happy about it. As he was driving in a chaise to another town, he came to a lonely bit of road late in the afternoon, and was just thinking what a good place it was for robbers when he saw a bad-looking man come out of the woods in front of him and go slowly along as if waiting till he came up. The thought of the money made Grandfather rather anxious, and at first he had a mind to turn round and drive away. But the horse was tired, and then he did not like to suspect the man, so he kept on, and when he got near and saw how poor and sick and ragged the stranger looked, his heart reproached him, and stopping, he asked in a kind voice, "My friend, you look tired. Let me give you a lift." The man seemed surprised, hesitated a minute, and then got in. He did not seem inclined to talk, But Grandfather kept on in his wise, cheerful way, speaking of what a hard year it had been, how much the poor had suffered, and how difficult it was to get on sometimes. The man slowly softened a little, and won by the kind chat told his story, how he had been sick, could get no work, had a family of children, and was almost in despair. Grandfather was so full of pity that he forgot his fear, and asking the man his name, said he would try to get him work in the next town, as he had friends there. Wishing to get at pencil and paper to write down the address, Grandfather took out his plump pocketbook, and the minute he did so, the man's eye was on it. Then Grandfather remembered what was in it, and trembled for his money, but said quietly, "Yes, I have a little sum here for some poor orphans. I wish it was my own. I would so gladly give you some of it. I am not rich, but I know many of the trails of the poor. This $5 is mine, and I want to give it to you for your children." The hard, hungry look in the man's eyes changed to a grateful one as he took the small sum freely given and left the orphan's money untouched. He rode on with Grandfather till they approached the town. Then he asked to be set down. Grandpa shook hands with him and was about to drive on when the man said, as if something made him, "I was desperate when we met, and I meant to rob you, but you were so kind I couldn't do it. God bless you, sir, for keeping me from it."
"Did Grandpa ever see him again?" asked Daisy eagerly.
"No, but I believe the man found work and did not try robbery any more."
"That was a curious way to treat him. I'd have knocked him down," said Dan.
"Kindness is always better than force. Try it and see," answered Mr. Bear, rising.
"Tell another, please," cried Daisy.
"You must. Aunt Jo did," added Demi. "Then I certainly won't, but keep my others for next time. Too many tales are as bad as too many bonbons. I've paid my forfeit, and I go."
And Mr. Bear ran for his life with the whole flock in full pursuit. He had the start, however, and escaped safely into his study, leaving the boys to go rioting back again. They were so stirred up by the race that they could not settle to their former quiet, and a lively game of blind man's buff followed, in which Tommy showed that he had taken the moral of the last story to heart, for, when he caught Nan, he whispered in her ear, "I'm sorry I called you a crosspatch." Nan was not to be outdone in kindness, so when they played button, button, who's got the button, and it was her turn to go round, she said, "Hold fast all I give you," with such a friendly smile at Tommy that he was not surprised to find the horsehair ring in his hand instead of the button. He only smiled back at her then, but when they were going to bed he offered Nan the best bite of his last apple. She saw the ring on his stumpy little finger, accepted the bite, and peace was declared. Both were ashamed of their temporary coldness. Neither was ashamed to say, "I was wrong. Forgive me." So the childish friendship remained unbroken, and the home in the willow lasted long, a pleasant little castle in the air. End of chapter 20.